Welcome to the Food Clues podcast, where we dive deep into the world of holistic health and wellness, conquering your food allergies and intolerances one bite at a time. I'm your host, Dr. Alexis Sams, holistic physical therapist, food allergy specialist, but you can call me the food allergy doc. With this podcast, I'm all about helping you conquer your food allergies naturally. Through my unique Food Clues treatment approach, I've helped hundreds of people uncover the root causes of their food reactions and achieve true freedom from allergies and intolerances by identifying the missing links between their trigger foods and the underlying causes driving those triggers. In each episode, I'll be sharing the latest in my holistic health practices. I'll also be sharing transformative success stories. I'll bust some common myths surrounding healthcare and food allergy management and provide practical tips to support your healing journey. Whether you're struggling with chronic food allergies or looking for natural ways to manage other symptoms and enhance your well-being, this podcast is for you. Today's episode is packed with insights and actionable advice for better health that's right up your alley. So let's get started on the path to a happier, healthier you. Hey everybody, welcome to the Food Clues podcast. I'm your host and equal opportunity eater, Dr. Alexis Sams, aka the Food Allergy Doc. And today is the first of a little mini series that I'm going to be doing, breaking down a couple of crucial things that influence how our bodies conquer our food allergies and intolerances. I'm gonna kind of lovingly call this series The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And today we're going to be talking about histamine. It's been on my mind to talk about. I've been talking to a lot of my clients about it because it's way more and way deeper than just the sneezing and the itchiness and the skin breakouts that you experience with your food reactions. There's a little bit more complexity to it. Not necessarily more complicated, I guess. And maybe that's not even the right word. There's lots of details, but the details aren't necessarily hard. But it's in those details that provide better solutions for resolving the symptoms and for keeping you moving forward on your food allergy freedom journey, like overall. So, like I said, we're gonna call it the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we're gonna break it all down. Starting with, what exactly is histamine? So, it's a chemical. Most generally, it's classified as a neurotransmitter, and it has many different functions and comes from different sources. The overall thing with the histamine levels in the body and the way that histamine performs in the body is that balance and proper use is key. And that's essentially why I'm calling this series The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, because there is a lot of goodness to histamine, but when it gets out of hand or imbalanced, that's where things can get a little bad and ugly. So let's talk about where it comes from first before we get into the details. So most of us have an appreciation that histamine comes from those immune cells. You may have heard the term mast cells, as in mast cell activation syndrome, or the MCAS, that is commonly associated with allergic reactions in general and also food reactions. So yes, histamine does come from the release of mast cells, which are blood-based immune cells. It also comes from basophils, which I believe are lymph-based immune cells, I believe. I might need to double check on that one. But the other places that histamine can come from are from our gut bacteria levels after the process of fermentation. I don't know where my where my tongue is here. Fermentation. So when gut bacteria goes through the fermentation process, which is a natural process that is supposed to go through to break down certain carbs and fibers so that it can help maintain gut integrity, regulate inflammation, and do other things, that process is called fermentation. But the after effect, or the byproduct of that fermentation process, is the production of histamine. And it's up to a certain enzyme, which you may have heard of as DAO. DAO is supposed to break down the histamine after fermentation has taken place. So again, where is histamine coming from? It comes from our mast cells basophils, gut bacteria after the process of fermentation. It also has food sources, so fermented foods, aged cheeses. The precursors of histamine are called histidine with a D, and those can be found in red meat. And then part of your brain, the hypothalamus, or an organ associated with your brain, I should say, also produces some amounts of histamine to help our bodies function. So now that we know where it comes from, let's talk about the goodness of histamine. And I think it's important to know the goodness of histamine because it does have its proper place in keeping us happy. I think sometimes it does tend to get a little bit of a bad rap because we only associate histamine with like an elevated or an abnormal response. So let's talk about the goodness of histamine. One, it does produce vasodilation. So histamine helps to expand blood vessels. And why can that be good? Because then it gives a more open pathway for immune cells to get to an area and kill germ invaders or heal the body, in an area that's injured. So that's good. Histamine also activates the immune response. It's like one of the dominoes that tips over to get your immune response alive and kicking. It also increases the permeability of vessels, the ability for immune cells to transport themselves across like the vessel integrity, across the vessel membrane and linings so that it can get to target tissues where the germ is and or where the injury is. It also stimulates mucus production to trap and eliminate germs. It stimulates mucus production in your airways, in your digestive tract, in your bronchi, where air gets in and out of the body. It also produces mucus along the reproductive areas, along the vaginal area and along the uterus. Again, all for capturing, breaking down, and eliminating germs and toxins from the body. So it also stimulates bronchoconstriction in certain instances. So it prevents germs from getting into the lung tissue by narrowing the airway so that those germs physically can't get into further down into our breathing areas and into that lung tissue. The reverse of that is it stimulates coughing for clearance of germs and toxins from your bronchial tubes and bronchial areas. Another good thing that it does is it produces or stimulates the churning, that wave-like contraction in our digestive tract to help clear unwanted germs in the gut lining. It also stimulates gastric acid production in the stomach so that you can digest germs that you might have ingested through food. And then remember when I said that histamine is also produced in some levels in the brain? Well, histamine does have some good for brain function. It helps to regulate focus and alertness. It helps to modulate pain. And it also helps us to signal and control our hunger and appetite. So as you can see, histamine in the good has a lot of different functions to keep things operating happy and healthily. Now let's change perspective a little bit and talk about the bad, like the not so good things about histamine. And that's where I want to introduce the term histamine intolerance, which most of us have heard, but I kind of want to shed a little light on that because if you've followed some of the work I do or you've listened to other episodes, you may have heard me use this concept or say what I'm about to say before, which is that lots of things in health serves or sits on a spectrum between normal and optimal function and dysfunction, disease, not so happy. So there's a range, a spectrum of where things can go wrong or where things can heal and get better. So I actually feel like the term histamine intolerance can be a little bit misleading only because it kind of gets us a little bit more tunnel vision and focused on the not so good end of the histamine spectrum. I would more call it maybe just just that, the histamine spectrum. And towards like the not so great end, that's where we could get into histamine intolerance. And then on the positive end, that's where we can get to like normal histamine function. The other perspective about histamine intolerance that I want to bring into the conversation is kind of a concept of relative versus real or absolute histamine intolerance. And here's what I mean by that. A lot of times, histamine intolerance specifically refers to the body's difficulty or dysfunction in breaking down and or eliminating histamine from the body. And I would call that kind of like the absolute or like the real histamine intolerance. But there's also conceptually, you can think about it in a relative way, relative histamine intolerance. That's kind of the way that flies under the radar sometimes and causes histamine buildup that not everybody completely like recognizes. And it happens when there's a buildup of histamine in the body that exceeds the body's natural rate to be able to break down and clear. So the intolerance, the difficulty with breakdown and elimination, isn't necessarily because there's a chemical missing or a process that's dysfunctional that's causing the breakdown. It might be because you're overproducing so much, there's a buildup and your body just can't keep up. So that's, in both of those cases, it still creates a situation of too much histamine in the body, and that's where the intolerance lies. But it can come from kind of two ends of, or two different perspectives. It can come from absolute, you're really just having a problem breaking it down and clearing it, or relative, you've just got so much that the rate of clearance is almost like insignificant or just really hard for your body to overcome. So I hope that makes sense. Now, what are some things that can cause histamine intolerance in both of those categories, like the absolute or the relative? So let's talk about enzymes and nutrient deficiencies. That usually goes on more the absolute side, the side where histamine intolerance is caused by difficulty actually breaking down and clearing the histamine from the body. If there's not enough of that DAO in the gut that I was talking about, remember when I said the gut bacteria produces histamine after it breaks down carbs and fiber in that process called fermentation. Histamine is a byproduct of that, and DAO is in the gut. That's supposed to break down histamine so that you can clear it from your body. If there isn't enough DAO, then the histamine sticks around in the gut and causes problems. If you recall when I said there are levels of histamine that's made in the brain. There's also a substance called, it's a long word, but for short, it's called HNMT. That's produced in the brain, and that's supposed to help break down and eliminate and keep histamine levels regulated in the blood. So if that's not being produced or there isn't enough of that, that can leave histamine hanging around in the brain area, causing issues. Key nutrient deficiencies, nutrients that the body needs in addition to your DAO and the HNMT to help break down and eliminate histamines, are B6 vitamin, copper, magnesium. A lot of those really help with the production, your body's natural ability to create that DAO in the gut. So if there's a nutrient deficiency, you're not intaking enough of those nutrients, or if there's an issue keeping you from absorbing those nutrients into the bloodstream and into the body so that you use it, that can reduce the production of DAO, and that can be another opportunity for histamine to be hanging around, not being able to be breaking down and eliminated, causing histamine intolerance. Let's talk about some other things that can be happening that can cause that same histamine intolerance response. General inflammation in the gut. Now we would have to figure out what's causing, it's not just inflammation comes from nowhere. So figuring out what causes the inflammation in the gut, but too much inflammation itself can damage and reduce the productivity of the cells that make DAO in the gut. Liver dysfunction. If there's something going on in the liver and the liver can't do its best job at detoxifying, breaking down, and detoxifying your general body from histamine, then histamine can build up in the liver, which will cause two things. One, your histamine intolerance, so you'll have symptoms of elevated histamines, but it can also further reduce the ability for your liver to perform its other functions. So built up histamine can also turn into liver dysfunction as well. Gut or digestive issues. The number one that's kind of on the top of my list is SIBO, the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. A lot of times that happens because there's an issue with digestion and breaking down of food. But bacterial overgrowth, specifically in the small intestine, can increase histamine producing bacteria. You're trying to ferment and break all that stuff down. So just the sheer volume of excess bacteria, when your body starts breaking it down, can cause just a relative overproduction or increase in histamine in your digestive tract. Let's talk about hormones. Hormones can also cause histamine issues. If there's elevated cortisol levels, that can lead to elevated histamine levels in the body. Histamine and estrogen are kind of like these BFFs in terms of their levels. They have a directly proportional relationship in their levels in the body. So what do I mean by that? If histamine levels rise, estrogen levels rise. If histamine levels drop, estrogen drops, which is good. But in a dysfunctional state, the higher your histamine goes, higher your estrogen goes. Higher your estrogen goes, higher your histamine goes. So wherever your estrogen levels lie, that could be another not so great consequence leading to elevated histamines in the body. Okay, let's talk about the bad in terms of histamine levels with brain. So brain stress, especially for females. Brain stress can cause dysfunction in the brain to ovary connection, which can disrupt estrogen levels, and we just kind of talked about that. Whether it's estrogen levels or relative to the levels of progesterone production in the body, that can lead to one of two things: elevated histamine levels if there's an overproduction or decreased estrogen clearance leading to an overproduction or overpresence of estrogen in the body. That can increase histamine levels, because remember, histamine and estrogen, when one goes up, the other goes up. If there's stress in the brain to ovary connection, that utilizes, or I guess I should say that results in overproduction or an increased level of cortisol. That elevated cortisol level can decrease histamine regulation in the brain as well, leaving histamine levels to rise accordingly and cause histamine intolerance that way. Estrogen does have good performance responsibilities for brain function. I'm not going to get into all those details, but just to know, estrogen does help promote healthy and happy brain function. But if there's increased estrogen levels in the brain because of poor clearance or elimination, it's not balanced. Again, that rise in estrogen can stimulate overproduction and overpresence of histamine in the brain area. If there's germs or toxins in the brain, we're talking about a dysregulated immune response. You can get into an MCAS type of response with mast cells or basophils in the brain area releasing histamine to help get those toxins and germs under control. Concussions can also lead to brain stress. We just talked about stress stimulating cortisol, or if that stress yields or results in inflammation or injury into the brain tissue, that'll stimulate immune responses, which if those immune responses become dysregulated, that can increase histamine presence in the brain and therefore histamine intolerance as well. So there's some brain things that can contribute to, bad levels of histamine. We already talked about digestive system. And then in general, which I kind of already mentioned, but the liver is the other major area where histamine intolerance can be problematic. If there's too much histamine built up from other areas in the body, sent to the liver for the liver to break it down and detoxify the body, but the liver can't for some reason, we can get buildup of histamine in that area or in that organ as well. And the things that can cause difficulty for the liver to break down and eliminate histamine, long list. It's relative to all the functions that the liver does, which if you've heard me before, the liver has 500 plus functions that it does to keep the body happy and healthy. Any of those operating in a dysfunctional state for too long can affect the liver's ability to do its other jobs correctly, including detoxification, which can cause reduction in detoxification of histamine, which can leave the histamine hanging around in the liver, waiting to be broken down and eliminated, causing inflammation, causing swelling in the liver, causing liver dysfunction. So, to recap, those are some of the reasons or some of the things that can go not so great in terms of histamine levels in the body. So we covered the good and the bad, but now let's cover the ugly. The ugly is going to be what these different dimensions of histamine intolerance looks like in the body. So first, let's cover the usual suspects. So the usual suspects when we've got histamine intolerance, whether it's the absolute or the relative, difficulty clearing or just overproduction beyond the rate of clearance. Your usual suspects are the swelling, the hives, the rashes, itching, other, skin changes and things like that. Those are the things that we're used to associating with an abnormal histamine level in the body or histamine response for, allergic reactions and things. But there's a good number of overlooked symptoms. And when I say overlooked, I mean overlooked in terms of when they happen, we may want to take a step back and say, are they happening because of a histamine-related issue? This is where it gets good. This is where knowing these overlooked symptoms can be an opportunity for taking a more strategic action to help get things healthier, happier, so that histamine levels drop, reactions overall drop, food tolerance increases. So let's talk about these overlooked symptoms that point to histamine intolerance that we don't really talk about too much. One heavy hitter is mucus, excess mucus production. Anywhere in those areas that we talked about, histamine contributing to mucus production in a good way. But if there's overproduction, we may be getting the hint, or the body may be trying to tell us there's a histamine issue there. So if we're coughing up phlegm, if we've got, a lot of mucus in our chest that we're always trying to clear up, if you're always coughing or clearing your throat, you're feeling like you're getting that mucusy buildup in your throat, whether you're coughing it up and out, or you're kind of like swallowing, phlegmy stuff. That's one sign. Mucus production in other areas. So if you're having like a mucusy stool, that can maybe be pointing to elevated histamine levels. Here's the kicker, ladies: excess discharge. A lot of mucusy buildup outside of our normal cycle, or if it's happening in the timely manner in that in our monthly cycle, but it's an overproduction, that can be a clue of unbalanced or unhappy histamine levels. Let's talk about some other overlooked symptoms as they relate to the brain. So we talked about histamine in a happy state is supposed to help with brain function. We talked about some of the ways that the brain function can be impaired relative to histamine levels. But what does it look like? It can look like brain fog. It can look like difficulty sleeping. It can look like vertigo. We talked about happy histamine function in the brain. Yes, it helps with alertness and focus. It also helps with keeping things like cool, calm, and collected. So histamine intolerance can look like anxiety. It can look like the inability to keep ourselves cool, calm, and collected. It can also look like overeating, snacking, cravings, especially for things that aren't necessarily the healthiest for us, our processed foods and snacks like that. Why? Because we talked about one of the good effects of healthy and happy histamine performance helps to regulate hunger. So if we're having an issue with hunger regulation, that could be one of those under the radar signs pointing to histamine intolerance. We talked about how one of the good effects of histamine performance has to do with vasodilation. So just regulating blood flow, getting blood, getting our immune cells and things like that where it needs to be in a timely manner. So radical changes in blood flow could be an indicator of histamine intolerance. What does that look like? heart palpitations, flushness or redness, dizziness, drops in blood pressure for either for no reason or particularly if any of these symptoms happen after eating. Remember when our body is supposed to be producing histamine as a byproduct during digestion? If there's an issue with histamine, it can come across as some of these blood flow looking issues. POTS, P-O-T-S, can also be an indication of that same type of abnormal histamine response affecting vasodilation. And then, of course, in the digestive system, we talked about the fermentation causing histamine. DAO is supposed to be there. If it's not there, histamine builds up. So what does that look like in the gut? Abdominal cramps. It can look like diarrhea. It can look like nausea or vomiting. It can look like acid reflux. Those are some of the heavy hitters in the digestive area. Hormonally, we kind of talked about this already, but hormonally, because histamine can be associated with abnormal levels of cortisol, estrogen, some progesterone in there too. It can also look like not just excess mucus production in that area, but a heavy bleed or intense menstrual cramps. Spotting, it can look like chest or breast tenderness. It can also look like elevations or more intense menopause symptoms or premenopause symptoms. It can also look like weight gain around that area. What else? Any of those symptoms, if you're familiar with the concept of estrogen dominance, that can also be an indicator of elevated histamine levels because we just said increased estrogen means increased histamine. It may be what's driving the increased estrogen is an elevated level or a continually rising level of histamine. Whether it's due to poor histamine clearance or overproduction past that rate that the body can clear it effectively. What else can it look like that's flying under the radar in terms of histamine intolerance? From a sensory perspective, it can look like itching, but without necessarily like skin changes. So just random itching from nowhere, or seams from nowhere. There can also be temperature changes. Sometimes that flies under the radar as a histamine intolerance or a histamine imbalance response. Sweating or like a hot flash type of a sensation, particularly after eating or after or during a bowel movement. I know this may sound like TMI to you guys, but in my world, there's no such thing as TMI because everything can be a clue to identifying ways to get your body to function better. But if you've ever been in the restroom and you're trying to have a bowel movement and you literally just burn up hot. This used to happen to me when I was younger, and I've heard stories of people experiencing this before. You literally want to start peeling your clothes off. You're so hot, when you're trying to have your bowel movement. A lot of times that's linked to elevated histamine levels. Sun sensitivity can also be linked to histamine levels as well. So if the sun makes your skin feel itchy, if it makes your skin feel sensitive, tender, things like that. So what do we do with all this information? I think if there's anything that I want to stress about what I've kind of covered in the good, the bad, and the ugly, it's this. If you're having two things. If you're having persistent regular looking or traditional histamine looking symptoms and they're not going away. So remember we talked about the usual suspects, the sneezing, the itchy, the watery eyes, the runny nose, those common histamine responses. If they're persistent and not going anywhere, it may be caused by a mismatch between what's driving the histamine response and the treatment that you're getting for it. Same thing with the not so usual suspects. If some of those things that I listed are things that you're experiencing, and again, they're persistent, they're not changing, they're not going away. One, they could be related to imbalanced histamine levels that necessarily no one's brought up that perspective to you. And two, it can also be because of a cause and treatment mismatch. It may be that the treatment that you're trying to get for one of those symptoms is ineffective because you're not treating it based on the thought that it may be related to histamine imbalance. And this is where assessment really is the key thing. So you may, have been listening to this and thinking to yourself, okay, so what about MCAS? Where does the mast cell activation syndrome fit into this whole picture? Well, for me, what I've learned, and when I'm working with clients, what I have learned is that MCAS is a specific histamine response, and it's specific to histamine intolerance due to increased histamine release from those mast cells. And so if you look at it from another perspective, you can consider that not all histamine intolerance, we just talked about it in the good, the bad, the ugly, not all histamine intolerance is due to MCAS. And so take that a step further. If you're getting a common treatment for MCAS, like whether it's a prescription medication for MCAS stability, whether it's something like a Claritin or a Zyrtec or something like that, or even you're getting, somebody suggested a DAO supplement. If you're getting those treatments that are more common to MCAS and it's not working, it's not reducing your histamine response, that very well probably means that your histamine response is not immune-based. It's not MCAS related. It's not from excess release of histamine from mast cells. It may not even be from excess histamine release from basophils. It may be from some of those other things that we've already discussed. It may be from decreased of that HNMT in the brain, and the elevated histamine levels is in your brain tissue, and that's why you're having histamine symptoms. It may come from poor estrogen clearance or poor estrogen usage from the body. So excess estrogen is building up, and we talked about estrogen levels rise, histamine levels rise. So my point is, histamine intolerance, like we've been talking about, comes from lots of different things other than the immune system response. So I'm going to say it one more time. The take-home message with all of this can be, if you're somebody who is experiencing a lot of histamine-related symptoms and you're getting like an MCAS treatment and you feel like it's not working, then essentially your histamine response probably isn't immune system related. Which, if you follow anything that I've been saying in the past, it's basically a specific example of the phrase that I always use: the body will never hesitate to heal when you present it with the right solution. If you're not presenting it with the right solution, may not necessarily heal. So, if treatment's not working, it's probably not MCAS. That's why I said assessment is key. And so, where does assessment fit in? How do I know, where my histamine intolerance may be coming from? Like, what are the clues or what are the things that I can be looking for to help me figure all this out? I got you. And that's where food clues comes in, guys. Every food you avoid is a clue to your health. So, did you know that there are certain foods that if you're avoiding them, they do kind of relate to a specific area or a specific cause of the histamine intolerance? They can give a clue, or if you were my client, they would give me a clue that there may be a histamine issue in a certain area, in a certain organ, in a certain system. And I'm not going to leave you hanging. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So if there was somebody who I suspected, or in their history, I suspected that they had some like histamine, issues, and I'm trying to figure out where in the body is the histamine issue. Is it coming from, the gut and the fermentation, and there's a problem with breaking down the histamine in the gut, so we're getting built up there? Is it something going on with the brain and there's low HNMT and something going on there? Is it immune related? There's an infection, and so the body just keeps releasing the histamine through the MCAS? Or is there a liver backup? So then histamine going to the liver isn't being able to be broken down effectively. So the liver is the source of where like the histamine intolerance is. So, yeah. Where does that all get, sorted out? Here you go. Food avoidances, whether it's an allergy, intolerance, sensitivity, just a food avoidance in general, that could point more towards the liver being the problem in your overall histamine reaction would be cilantro, um, cured meats, eggs, garlic, onion, black teas, and even some of your like cruciferous vegetables like the broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, specifically those because those vegetables have properties that the liver uses for detoxification. So avoiding those issues or avoiding those foods more or less lets me know that the body may be struggling with liver detox because you're not welcoming the vegetables that support it. So those are some examples of foods that somebody might avoid if a histamine issue was related to a problem with the liver. Let's move on. Foods you might avoid if the histamine problem was related to your brain: pickles, vinegars, liquor. So, and I guess I should take a little step back. Alcohol, like beer and wine, might be an indicator that the histamine issue is liver related. Avoidance or reactions with liquors, your vodka, your rum, your tequila, those may be a little bit more indicative of a histamine issue that may have a source in the brain. What other types of foods? Chocolate, cocoa, caffeine are people that, really react to coffee. It goes right through them. It causes the diarrhea that we talked about was one of the bad consequences that flies under the radar. Artificial sweeteners or MSG, monosodium glutamate. There are less and less foods that are being produced with MSG, but it's still around. So those are examples of foods that you might avoid if your brain was like the source of the histamine issue. Third on the list, gut. So if it was truly more or less a gut relation or a gut related issue, there's an issue with that DAO production so that histamine can be broken down in the gut. Food clues there might be avoidance or reactions to tuna, sardines. Here's a big one: tomatoes. How many of you guys know somebody, or if it's you, that doesn't like tomatoes? Aged cheeses, so like aged Swiss, Parmesan, things like that. Your fermented foods, sauerkraut, your kimchis, kombuchas, things like that. Cured meats, salamis, pepperonis, citrus fruits, and in general, leftovers. If you or someone you know like hates leftovers, there a lot of times leftovers or the cooling, refrigeration, and then like reheating of foods releases histamines from the foods themselves, and so ingesting that elevated histamine level in the presence of difficulty or building histamine levels in the gut can be a sign of more gut focused or gut related histamine reactions. And then finally, like immune system, like a true like MCAS. Those food clues are going to be related to foods that feed germ sources. And they're usually not going to be the most like healthy foods because most of our germs tend to thrive off of processed sugars and things like that. So again, food clues that might gravitate towards more of that true MCAS type of histamine intolerance or histamine response are going to be cravings for things like fried foods, sugars, like I said, things that aren't necessarily the most healthy, your cured meats. Definitely not liking spicy foods can be a food clue related to MCAS being a driver of the histamine response. Why? Because a lot of natural spices actually kill most germs. Oregano, rosemary, thyme, just to name a few. Those are very like antimicrobial, anti-parasitic, antibacterial. So the body avoiding those things is kind of a weird perspective, but it's also kind of a signal of a germ presence and that germ wanting you to reject anything that actually might kill it. So as I kind of wrap things up, we've kind of covered a few things. One, what histamine actually is, the good about it, what it's supposed to do and help in terms of keeping us happy and healthy. It's supposed to help us kill germs. It's supposed to be cleared out of the gut after we break down foods. It's supposed to help with some of our brain function. It's supposed to produce mucus and stuff to help us eliminate germs. So there's definitely some good to it. But then there's some consequences when it gets too elevated. It can cause overproduction of mucus. It can cause difficulties with focus and alertness. It can, cause overeating because it's not suppressing that hunger sensation like it's supposed to. So there are bad consequences when histamine gets, out of whack. And then we talked about the ugly. We talked about the usual suspects that we know about in terms of what it looks like when we're in a histamine intolerant state or status. But then we talked about some of the symptoms that kind of fly under the radar that get overlooked as a cause or as a result of histamine intolerance. So what was the take-home message? If you're having some of those symptoms and they're not going away, histamine could be one of the hidden factors that's driving them. Or if you've been diagnosed with a histamine-related issue and the treatment that you're using or that's being given to you doesn't seem to be helping the histamine symptoms, it may be that your histamine issue is coming from a source that's not related to the treatment solution, meaning the treatment solution was not created to resolve histamine issues for your specific cause. And that's why it's not working. It's a cause-treatment mismatch. Assessment's key. And then we finished up with some food clues that can help kind of narrow down where your histamine issue might be coming from. And side note, this does not mean that all of your histamine issues are going to come from one source. In most, nearly every case, it doesn't just come from one source. But what that does mean is, again, if treatment isn't working or treatment's working a little bit, but you're not getting the full result, those can be indicative of a combination of causes driving histamine intolerance. And it may be that the solutions for the different causes needs to be a little bit different. You need to have a combination in your treatment plan to address all the areas or all the issues driving the histamine intolerance. All right, guys, so that wraps up the good, the bad, and the ugly for histamine. I was very fortunate, I guess might be the word. And I really enjoyed isn't the right word, but I was very grateful. I'll say that. I was extremely grateful to finally get through the research and the learning in terms of histamine. It's been something on my radar for a while that I didn't have as much understanding as I do now. And it's definitely been empowering to be able to answer questions more effectively for clients. I've already incorporated it into my Food Clues Total Freedom program. So now we have a better histamine screen in the assessment, and we have a better histamine elimination solutions within the treatment regimen. So all of this helps me to help you guys, but I hope the information has been insightful and valuable to you. Stay tuned for more good, bad, the ugly. I think I'm going to be doing serotonin next. It's definitely on the list, but I've got some other ones that I want to cover for you guys too, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be serotonin on the list. So, take care. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the Food Clues podcast. I hope you found today's talk insightful and inspiring as you navigate your journey towards better health and wellness. Ready to take the first step in conquering your food allergies? Visit www.myfoodclues.com/quiz and take the Food Clues quiz today. In less than 5 minutes, you'll get your first food clue to identify the likely causes of your food reactions. This will be your first opportunity to uncover the hidden factors impacting your health and start your journey towards food freedom. Stay connected by following the Food Allergy Doc on Instagram. Enjoy the Food Allergy Freedom Collective on Facebook, where you'll find a supportive community and valuable resources to help you on your path to wellness. And don't forget to subscribe to the Food Clues podcast so you never miss out on an episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review and share it with someone you know. Thanks for listening, and remember, your food clues are the key to conquering your food allergies. Take the quiz, join our community, and let's achieve food freedom together.